In fact, some of the helpers are here, come down every Sunday, except on the holy days, which there was one just a while ago, and I got it mixed up. So I sort of Yom Kippur, but it wasn't over here for that weekend, it was the one before. They weren't, but they come down and do the meal every Sunday for the homeless and marginalised, and cook up a feast. And that to me is one of the most important things happening here. It's interfaith stuff, dialogue happening at a real level of common service. So that's really good. In fact, today we've had that group come in, we had an Aboriginal group here. Now we're back to Judaism. So we've got Judaism, Aboriginal, Judaism. So it's an interesting juxtaposition. So Jeffrey, we really do welcome you, and we look forward to your words of wisdom. Megan, welcome.
Thank you, John, and it's good to see everyone. Some people I haven't seen for a long time, so it's nice to meet some of the members of the synagogue as well.
Yeah, I thought you were talking about.
No, in fact, I haven't seen Gordon and Elaine for ages, so it's really nice to see you here. Tonight, I've been asked to speak for about 20 some odd minutes and then take questions, but I'm happy if you want to interrupt me anytime in the, quote, formal presentation, and I'll take questions at any time. So I want to call tonight's talk The Vital Role of Religion in the 21st Century. And the reason that I want to begin with this vital role is to think about how most of us, I think, I don't know about people here, but people I encounter think about religion generally, which is it's about the worst thing that's happened to the planet, and Dawkins' theory, the God delusion, and others about the Atheist Manifesto. If this were only the way, that would be a much better place to live. And given the record of religion on, perhaps let's say first glance, one might agree with this perception. For example, well, we don't have to go far, just last week, an Islamic group wreaking havoc in Nairobi. But, if we think about the Islamic threat to the world on the way it's referred to is Islamist, and those people that speak in the name of Islam and blow up Buddhas out there in Afghanistan, and kill women who have had sex outside, the approved marital situation, and so on and so forth, let alone the wars of the Sunnis and the Shias. So Islam has its bad name and its problems. And if we're going to turn to Christianity, I come from the States, and it's not quite as prevalent or ominous here in Australia, but we're a much smaller country of only 20 some odd million people, whereas the States with its hundreds of millions, approximately 1/3 of them identify as evangelical Christians. And I don't know how much contact you have with evangelical Christianity, which one of its tenets would be that the rapture is coming. Now, the rapture is the time of the second coming of the Messiah, is defined within those branches of Christianity. And based on its Judaic roots, it has this premise of, yes, but first a little apocalypse. So what we want to have is the end of time, when the Messiah will come back, and before that end of time, we need a little bit of an apocalypse. So things like global warming, even if there were a human component to it, well, that's a good thing, because environmental disaster is just part of the disaster that God plans for the world. Cataclysmic war between Israel and its neighbors, well, that is actually part of the divine plan. And at the end of the divine plan, well, then, those who believe will go to heaven and everyone else will suffer their fate, let alone the notion that because the fetus is a holy life, we should be able to murder abortionists who may be practicing abortion because you're protecting that holy life of the fetus, and all kinds of things are done, therefore, in the name of Christianity that make people think that, religion, this is a pox upon all people. And as a Jew, well, we're very, very lucky. First of all, there's only 14 million of us, so we don't really create as much of a splash as, when there's a billion Muslims and a billion Catholics and Christians. Obviously, that if there's a minority that has a rather extremist point, that minority adds up to a lot of people. But we do have our minority as well. And so our extremists are there, and particularly active in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and making sure that, things are done to preserve Jewish sovereignty over the whole land of the God-promised Israel, no matter what happens to the other inhabitants of the land. And of course, some of you may know and some of you may not, but those religious extremists were particularly involved in the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, who was reaching out to create a peace treaty just 20 years ago, and are also often in the vanguard and in the forefront of other attacks against people who don't believe or don't think like they, especially in the land of Israel. So when we see religion in its extreme forms, it's no wonder that a lot of people kind of respond to John Lennon's Imagine if there were no religion, and dream of a world where there would just be kind of like one humanity and, one sense of being, and we'd all live happily ever after together, all together. And so religion, how can it play a vital role if vitality means life, and often the basic presentation of religion out there is one that is seemingly destructive of other people's lives. And that, as I want to make clear, happens in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam. And I have to say, it's not just in the 21st century, but you can go back to our foundational texts as well. For depending on how you want to look at our foundational texts, there's parts of the Bible that are absolutely based in conflict of the Jews, our people, against the other peoples in the area. Christianity, there, for all its talk of, love, and it's the God of love, there's aspects in the Christian gospel, and certainly in the teachings of the fathers, that are about, we ain't with us, you against us. And there are, already when Christianity became powerful, with Constantine as the Roman Empire, he took the cross and turned it into a triumphalist symbol and said, by this you shall be conquered. And there have been many episodes like that, let alone what happens in Islam, and the notion that people, if they're not people of the book, have a choice of death or conversion. So it's not just the 21st century, but some of these people who are the religious extremists can actually go back to the book of their scripture, whether it's, as Jews, our Torah, Christians, their gospel, Muslims, their Quran, and they can find support for their position in these documents. So again, I ask, how can religion play a vital role in the 21st century? And what I want to say, and I think, John's church is an important example of it, bringing people together, is that, yes, that is part of religion, but that is not necessarily what religion is. Religion is a lot more than that as well. And I want to get some definitional points out there that I think are really important for all of us in the 21st century. The first is, I often find people saying, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And I probe what that means. And so my sense of what it means to be spiritual is to, in the binary system in which we do exist, that is, it's either 0 or 1, the spiritual says that there is something in life beyond the material. The non-spiritual position, therefore, is the material position. So the material position, and it's not, by the way, these are absolutely faith perspectives, all right? Because ultimately there's an unknown behind everything. So the material perspective, cheers, thank you very, very much. Cheers. Actually, I'll leave it here, thank you. The material perspective says, we got the Big Bang, we got matter, we have energy, that's all there is. Whatever the 5 senses can be in touch with, that's all there is. It's just physical reality. Some of the dearest members of my family and closest friends are materialists. And I'm not saying by being a materialist that you want to live in a fancy neighborhood and drive a sharp car. It just means that you only think that physical reality is the only reality that there is. That when your body decomposes, as it will, that's all that it will do. That anything that you call consciousness is just a matter of the synapses of your brain firing in an amazing way. Now, a spiritualist is someone different, and the spiritualist can identify through any of the 3 monotheistic religions that I've mentioned, or as a Hindu, or as a Buddhist, or as a native person of his or her own country, as the Aborigines here, I would say, are spiritual people. Now, what do I mean by spiritualists? Is that you say beyond matter and energy, there is something that we will call, now we run out of a right word, so we use words spirit, being, conscious energy, or something like that. We play around with words, but what we're sensing is that beyond the physical world that began with the hydrogen exploding into the Big Bang of evolution billions of years ago, leading to us here having this conversation now, there is some sense of conscious unity of being that lies beyond that, no matter how you connect with it. Now, to me, if there's questions later, we want to make sure that that we're kind of agreeing on that definitional point of materialist and spiritualist. Now, once you're a spiritualist, if you actually have that sense that there is some sense of being or spirit beyond the physical, now you have a problem. You want to get in touch with it. You may have your own personal practice. You may serve. You may walk along the beach, up in the mountains, out in nature. Nature is often the first place of contact. You may then begin meditative practices. You may want to start rituals around knowing that there are the 2 definitions of time. The materialist definition of time, which is there is, the moment leading to the moment leading to the moment, and the spiritualist, that there is something that we call infinity, that is beyond all time, past, present, and future, melding into one. Well, you might start developing rituals to celebrate that sense. Fine. But now what happens if you want to share that? You want to say, let's connect on a spiritual level. Let's not just be in this material level. You need a language. You need a way to share it with your community or your family. And if you really deeply see this as being the ultimate essence and reality of what life is, then you actually want to develop a way not only of sharing it in your community, but being able to transmit this deeper insight to the generations who will come. That communication, that conversation, is what I define as religion. So spirituality is where an individual holds, and then religion becomes the conversation to share spiritual insight within a group across the community and a group across the generations. In this, it's important to understand that there is no such thing as an exclusive religious truth. There are only religious forms of communication. Now, religion, therefore, has a vital role to play in the 21st century, because my understanding of the humanity that we are now is that ultimately human beings have spiritual sense, spiritual desire, spiritual quest. My limited understanding of Aboriginal culture is that it's been here in this land for 40 to 60,000 years and has always had spiritual forms of communication, spiritual insights. And similarly, the Native Americans, where I grew up, while they didn't have the same thousands of years of history, certainly were people who had a spiritual sense of communication. So what's the problem in the 21st century? The 21st century's problem is how we relate to our books. And here I also, those of you who are part of my congregation, our congregation, Emmanuel Synagogue, know that I've been speaking about this, with some sense of ignorance, but nevertheless loving the concept. So ignorance in the sense that I don't deeply understand what Aboriginal Dreamtime is, but on the other, love what the image is to me, in the sense that these are levels of, other forms of consciousness that are being transmitted through story and ritual from one generation to the next, but understood that it is story and it is ritual. And this is my challenge. Folks, I knew that would happen, but that's okay. I have reserves here. My sense is that the religious struggle that we have in the 21st century is to understand our books much more in that sense of Dreamtime, so that what our Bible says is nowhere that it's the literal Word of God. It doesn't say that. I mean, obviously, God is speaking to the people and there's this interaction between God and the people. But there's no insistence in the Torah that it's all the literal Word of God. Over time, there have been certain aspects of it that have crystallized so that there is a received tradition within what we call the Orthodox tradition that says this is what God commands. But what I'm inviting my congregation to do, and other rabbis are doing, and I'm aware, for example, of Bishop Spong in the Catholic Church, and I know, John's Voice, and I know others, and there's some in the Islamic world as well, who are starting to say that what we need to understand is that Scripture is not the literal word from God, but it's our received ancestral wisdom in conversation toward God. What does that do? That gives us the ability to take the deep wisdom that is here, and I promise you there's some very beautiful deep wisdom in our Torah, and to use that in the 21st century to highlight issues that need to be highlighted, And then on the other hand, to use our wisdom as well, to take things that have been raised in our scripture that are deleterious to life in the 21st century and say, you know what? These no longer apply or can be used and read in the way that they were. Now you say, wait a minute, how can you do that? You know, it's the received tradition. How can you change the received tradition? Actually, I'm not changing the received tradition. I'm actually doing what my ancestors always did with the received tradition, which was to apply it in its time. I'll give an example in the Torah itself, but it's a little bit too complex to go into, you know, without the text in front of you, you know, real text analysis. But you might have heard that there's this passage in the Torah where it says, God will visit the sins of the children upon the third and the fourth generation. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's actually in what's known as the Ten Commandments, is where it appears. And then it has a little footnote, and will you know, extend loving kindness to those who love God for 1,000 generations, meaning forever. Now, a few chapters later, when another insight is taught, it's taught just the opposite. There's dozens of descriptions of a loving God forever, and a little footnote about visiting the sins of the generations. And when you get to later books in the Bible, by that time it says an individual is responsible for his or her own deeds. And so in the Bible itself, you already see adaptations. In our ancient rabbis of thousands of years ago, you see how issues that were problematic for them, they actually did the same thing. They reasoned them away, and for issues that they thought were important, like let's say the celebration of Shabbat, they expanded it and expanded it. And all I'm inviting is within our Jewish people, for our people to do the exact same thing. To take the words, not only of the Bible, but the received tradition, to learn them, to study them, and to understand where we expand certain principles and constrict other ones. And the final point is, on the basis of what? On the basis of that which I will call vitality, which is, of course, based in a Latin root, vita, speaking about life. If we are spiritualists, if we are people who really believe that the ultimate creation is about the singularity of being, about the deepest aspects of consciousness, then what we must always be doing with the words that have been handed down to us, the traditions that have been handed down to us, the rituals that have been presented to us by our ancestors, is to make sure that we are using them to celebrate that essence and vitality of being. When our words and our traditions are no longer enhancing the creation, but rather are bringing divisiveness and disaster, then that's the time we understand that however our teaching was used and understood thousands of years ago, it has to be altered now, reinterpreted, reapplied. And I'm happy in the Q&A to give any kinds of specific examples to that general teaching that I wanted to share with you today. So, Q&A time.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.
I got a comment, Jeffrey.
Yes,
you talk about like religion as being like a conversation that comes from your spirituality. There's just so many conversations out in the world at the moment, and they're expanding almost as quick as the universe. You know, with blogs and the internet, some conversations that go on. There's just, you know, the multiplicity is just getting more and more diverse, and that's probably one of the biggest problems, is that we're all sort of finding a niche little thing that takes us maybe into a little bit of another direction and sort of branching off And that diversity kind of gets us off the same page. In a sense, that's what religion's always done anyway, because but usually in a smaller, like in the context of, say, Christianity, there's half a dozen different sects of Christianity, or in Judaism, I don't know how many there are, but there's a reasonable small amount, but now it's just getting more and more, and that's probably one of the biggest problems of the 21st century, is the number of different, options, the versions.
And I guess,
how do we all bring that in?
yeah. So I guess for me, as I was becoming engaged with spiritual quest decades ago, one of the things that a quotation to which I often refer, so apologies to Kaz, who's heard me speak too many times, that is a lovely teaching from Carlos Castaneda in his first book, The Teachings of Don Juan, where Don Juan, he goes to have his encounter with this mystic in the desert of the Southwest, and Don Juan says to him, basically there's only one ultimate reality, yet there's billions of paths toward that, and all you have to do is have a path with heart. So I'm not worried too much about the multiplicity of things, in the sense that I'm not chauvinistic or triumphalistic in that sense. As a Jew who knows that I'm representing people who, our history probably goes somewhere 3,000-4,000 years back, and to me that's an extraordinary reality and a precious thing, and I don't want us to disappear, but it's up to us as Jews to know our story, to teach our story well, and to practice our rituals. And if we fail to do that without meaning, and there's another competing idea out there that presents it, then we lost and we failed. As long as in that multiplicity, it's a path with heart, and that understands what I always like to refer to as the unity of being. So you may know that at Emmanuel Synagogue itself, I took it from being a strictly reform or progressive synagogue to be a pluralistic community. So I actually am one who welcomes diversity, as long as there is not divisiveness in that diversity. Where I get concerned is where whoever's voice it is, they think that they know it all, they have the exclusive truth, and that therefore they can use their truth to make others bad and wrong. As long as one is using those multiplicity of teachings to embrace all people, whether you're one of their practitioners or not, to respect people who are celebrating their conscious being, their creative genius, their individual personality. As long as you are not causing harm to other human beings, to animals.
Expand that 14 million. So it's a different sort of framework to a lot of Christian and Islamic frameworks that are expansionist sort of missionary religions.
So let me put it, that relates to the whole notion of the chosen people, because kind of out there is this concept of the chosen people. And I have to acknowledge that among Jews, there are, thank God, the minority, those Jews who are very chauvinistic and triumphalistic and see themselves in this role as the chosen people, as they got some special gift from God. But I have to say that the overall tradition, as understood back in the Bible, the rabbinic tradition of thousands of years ago, and most people I know, is that it actually relates to not the chosen people. We like to say more a chosen people. So again, using that Carlos Castaneda quotation from Don Juan, is that and when chosen is, again, this is why to me it's so important to teach Jews so we understand our own tradition, as opposed to just hearing words, oh, you're the chosen people. When that phrase is used, almost always throughout the Bible or throughout prayer language, it has to do with by living the Torah and connecting to the mitzvot. So that is to say that the definition of being a Jew is someone who accepts the Torah as your story and the mitzvot as your way of life. And it's basically beholden upon a Jew by birth, but any human being who wishes to relate to the singular being through the stories of the Torah and the living of mitzvot, the invitation is open. But you're absolutely right, John. We don't go, knocking on people's doors and saying, hey, you should do this. Now, interestingly enough, in Judaism, it is absolutely clear, except I get, again, for that small minority that is chauvinistic and triumphalistic, that whatever the afterlife might be, which is the most speculative conversation of the unknown, whatever it might be, it's open to every human being. That is the Jewish teaching. You do not have to be a Jew to be considered to have a soul that will live eternally. So I'm once, when I was a student rabbi, on a plane, and I'm, preparing my reading for the Shabbat, and sitting next to someone. This was in the south of the United States, part of that rupture land, the deep believing Baptists about whom I was speaking. The woman next to me realizes I'm studying some Hebrew. Elaine could relate to this. It's, back from the good old days. She says, and she works out I'm a Jew, and we have this conversation. And she says, so you don't believe in Jesus? I say, look, I believe Jesus was a great man, a Jew. I think he actually taught Torah. I think, I don't see anything different from Jesus and the Jewish milieu in which he lived and all that. But I certainly, from my Jewish understanding of all human beings, including Jesus, God doesn't manifest in the physical way that Christians claim. So you don't believe that Jesus is Son of God? No. She says, so you're going to burn in hell. I said, I don't think so, but I understand that you think so. She says, so what do you think? And I basically tell her my understanding that in Judaism, if you are essentially a good person, and here's the interesting thing. Remember I said Jews were expected to live by the teachings of Torah and the many mitzvot or commandments we learn from it. But for non-Jews, we actually don't expect, our definition of what is good for someone who's not Jewish is the following. You do not murder, you do not steal, you do not commit sexual immorality, you do not blaspheme, for whatever that means, you do not worship idols, you do not inflict cruel punishment on animals, and you establish courts of justice. So if a person is generally in that milieu, that's a good person according to Jews. And I said that to her. She said, so if you're right, I go to heaven, and but if I'm right, I'm going to go to, you're going to go to hell, and I'm going to go to heaven. She says, I'm going to follow my teaching because otherwise I could go to hell, right? And it's this weird logic that can't, because just in case that received tradition is really right, then that's it. And these are the problems that religion has. It's its triumphalism, it's its exclusivism, it's this notion that if you don't do it my way, you're going to burn in hell, and to make sure that you don't burn in hell, I'm going to kill you first. She wasn't that far, but that's actually part of the problem that we have. So really, the vital role, I'll say it really clearly, that all religion, and I invite you, is to go out there and you can be a believer in one Creator, and you can be a believer in your path to your Creator, but make sure that whatever is written is understood as a received ancestral teaching and not the exclusive truth from that infinite being from beyond, because there's a long way between infinity and here, and there's a lot of mistakes that are made between there in whatever our writings are as to what is true unity of love and being. Yeah.
With respect to Gordon, obviously the gigantic expanse of Aboriginal beliefs, which I certainly know this much about. You mentioned the three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as the religions of the book. I would bet anything that you have gone to many sessions with all three of those groups, as has John. So the question is, if it's true that in Judaism, as you seem to be a great indicator of this belief, and the wonderful Ronnie Kahn who's been here so often, is that we can have a range within our Judaism of people who believe in how literal that book is. And we know that in terms of Christianity, we can have from the fundamentalists to people like John, there's a range. How do you see having a conversation with the third group of people who seem to say every time I go through an activity that this is not our reception of it, this is unalterable, our book, because it is the word of the Supreme Being? How can we have a conversation with them if what I just said is true and that's what they say is true?
I think what you say is true for the most part, but this is what I like to say. Remember, our ancestors have been around, let's say, 3,000–4,000 years. So this story has gone through a lot, and it's a long and complex history of the Jewish people and Judaism to explain how we became so liberal so quickly. But it was only a few hundred years ago that the man who had the temerity to say that, you know, God and nature are one, Spinoza, was shamefully excommunicated by the leaders of his most advanced community in Amsterdam in the 1600s. And to this day, he is still excommunicated. And, you know, that cherem, as it's called in Judaism, has not been lifted by the... I'd lift it tomorrow. You know, he's not excommunicated in my mind, but I don't have the authority to lift it. What's happened in the history of the Jewish people, most likely because we're the oldest, and also because we've had, through our international dispersion, an extraordinary encounter with other thought and culture of which we've been very absorbent, because one of the core principles of Judaism from its very beginning is learning and wisdom and enlightenment and things like that. So we, as a very small people, have probably the largest percentage of non-fundamentalists and unorthodox, if you want to call that. Christianity is the next oldest. It's been around for a few thousand years. It's also had the benefit of the Renaissance and those kinds of factors, let alone the Enlightenment, but it wasn't so long ago that Galileo suffered his fate as well. Now, what we have to recognize, as those things were happening 1,000 years ago, Islam was actually relevant, or in comparison, quite an enlightened and advanced thing. But the problem is, again, you had Muhammad, who was its founder, and it's always good to be the last, because you can say, you know, they were great, but they got it wrong here, they got it wrong here, and we're the last and we're the right. And so there's that kind of embedded in the tradition. But as well, for, again, whatever the history of Islam and its relation to the Western world, it went into decline precisely at the time of the Renaissance. And I think that actually what we're going through is that very, very difficult revolutionary time within every major tradition that has, where Islam will liberalize. It's starting to happen, but unfortunately the people who have power and authority are very threatened by that and will use every means from violence and fear to hold on to their power. So I don't think it will be pretty, but actually there are a few Islamic voices out. I mean, you know, we can think of Salman Rushdie, for example. I mean, he came out of an Islamic world, or Ali Hassan, you know, and there are people out there who say there's problems with this, but you're absolutely right. Still, they have to seek protection or hide out or change identity or these kinds of things. But I do have, I guess I'm a man of faith, I do have faith that over the decades, if not the centuries, this will change. I think the human spirit for freedom, for the opening of mind and consciousness will seep into Islam as well. It's already starting to happen, and that's part of the reactive forces in Islam against it. But remember, they're only around for 1,300 years. In other words, they're still young. They really have not yet fully experienced their enlightenment. And that's kind of that, they call it now the conflict of the West. But this is actually, Steve, coming back to your question, that, actually here's where electronic media and access to kinds of things may help speed up that enlightenment and that transformation in the Islamic world. In the Jewish tradition, learning and education is absolutely the key and the core to it. And what I'm always on about is that we can never give over our authority to a book or to a man just because he claims it, and I use man intentionally because in those fundamentalist traditions, it's always a man who's claiming that kind of power authority over others. And it's just, enough is enough. But my hope is that we can do it through the religious conversation because there's a lot of beautiful insight that religion has to offer, and I'll come to that before we close as well. Just in the back.
Yeah, Jeffrey, we have people like, as you mentioned, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, atheists, and people like you would have heard of Lawrence Krauss.
Not Lawrence Krauss as well as the other two.
Anyway, what you're saying is that they say that there's no such thing as God, so they are hard materialists, as you say. If a scientist asks you, Jeffrey, how do you prove God? I mean, especially as when you started your speech, you mentioned something about planned disaster. Assuming that if there's a benign God, why did a benign God allow things like natural disasters like tsunami, and why didn't the God intervene to stop catastrophe, or even on a personal level in terms of what happened over in Auschwitz?
Correct.
Why didn't a benign, in other words, the problem of evil, okay? So which the atheists would say that if there's a benign God, if there is one, why didn't God intervene?
Okay. And here's that, which is an excellent question in the sense that I actually don't say that God is benign, right? So, and especially, so I have to embrace science. I think that, again, if knowing and awareness and consciousness is so important, then I think in the 21st century, it's really important that we say, to the best of our understanding, the theories of evolution and the Big Bang as to how humanity got here 15 billion years later is as best as we can get. And it goes back to the explosion of hydrogen and then helium and oxygen and carbon, and the next thing you know you have stars, and over time the stardust becomes animated, and we're having our little animated conversation here. Now, all I can say is that whether you be a scientist and a materialist, not all scientists are, but a scientific materialist or a spiritualist, you come back to the and what before. Now, the what before is the great unknown, the great mystery, and I think that, so how I define God is the ultimate mystery of the unknown beginning. But how I understand it is that it is a place of conscious being. See, we have one, there's only two, remember, it's the binary system. Either conscious being, which we are, we're clearly being and we're having a conscious conversation. So conscious being exists. And it either is coming out of the explosion of helium, or it's what precedes the explosion of helium. The great mystery is, how did the helium get there in the first place? And does it come out of being, or does being come out of the material? So I happen to be a spiritualist, and I say the material comes out of being. Materialists say being comes out of the material. But in all that, it is a very violent beginning. It is the Big Bang, after all. And here's the beauty of Judaism, in that in Judaism, this creator being actually is the creator of all. And that means that it, and I'll never use the word he, it allows, therefore, for the existence of everything binary and all its extremes. So once unity evolves into the material, we necessarily have division, light and dark, good and bad, right and wrong, da-da-da-da. And so in Isaiah, there's a beautiful teaching, it's one of my favorites, obviously, where Isaiah, who's one of our greatest teachers and prophets, lived about 2,700 years ago, says that God is the creator of good and bad. Hundreds of years later, thousands of years ago, our ancient sages spoke about, let's call it the amorality of nature, the violence of the universe. So that the way they describe it is that imagine, a thief goes down to, the store, and, well, they didn't have stores in those days, but we'll put it in a 21st century metaphor, goes down to Bunnings and, steals a whole shelf of seed, right? And puts it out in his garden. Next door, the neighbor, she's tenderly, taken the seed from her plants and replanted and grown her own garden. The sun's going to shine, the rain's going to fall, and their gardens are going to grow equally well because nature is amoral when it comes to earthquakes, tsunamis, and things like that. Nature is not a moral force, but beings have the option of morality, and so it is through this dual nature, and we can, as you say, go as extreme as we want. So you think it can happen. We can hunt Aborigines in Tasmania, we can kill Jews in Auschwitz, or we can do the kind of work, John, that you're doing here with our community, and so on and so forth. So religion, because it is, I haven't used this word yet, so I'll use it clearly, a human construct to how to have that spiritual conversation to connect with the unity of being. Religion can be used as a club and a sword, or it can be used as an embrace of love. And it's up to each of us to decide how we're going to use it. So the creator being allows for all of that. So my response is, I actually don't know that God is benign, but God, or that ultimate being, has given us the gift of love and goodness for us to choose.
But do you see it as a retribution from God? Do you see it as a punishment for our sins?
Never, absolutely not. So, and that's, in fact, tomorrow night's class. I teach a class on Monday night at my synagogue about the prayers. And tomorrow night we're talking about a prayer that's a classic reward and punishment prayer. And here are things where I have to say, I mess up all the time. My grandparents were beautiful, but I'm sure they messed up. I was too young to see it. And so I look back at my ancestors and I say, remember, it's a human construct. It's a conversation to reach toward God, not a dictation from God. And so while they imagine God as the great rewarder and punisher, that's not how I understand it. And I'm not familiar enough with the concepts of karma in Buddhist teaching to be able to address it fully. But, when people say, oh, what comes around goes around, I'm not convinced. And, when people come to me and a little child has died, they've completed their life and now their soul is in. I just don't buy it. When a little child dies, it's a tragedy, and I don't believe that there's punishment on the child or punishment on the parents. It's a tragedy.
One of the things just driving on for that, it comes from the Jewish tradition, of course, is Ali Wiesel in Night, where they're in Auschwitz, and of course the person's saying, where is God? They're hanging a little Jewish child, and where is God? Where is God? And Wiesel in the end turns and says, there, that. So and it's very deep. It's the idea that God actually enters into the world in the sense of suffering. in Christianity, it comes from Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was asked, said, God, only the suffering God can help us, in the same period as World War II. I'm just wondering how Wiesel saying that, how would that fit within the Jewish tradition?
No, well, I mean, certainly Wiesel was, grew up in a Hasidic family, in a very observant family, and understood the tradition, of course. And John, that suffering servant image comes from the prophet Isaiah as well. But and Elaine and I, we Cantor Deutsch, who would often refer to those stories as well when he was a survivor of Mauthausen and other camps, and God was there suffering with me, is what he would say. But how my preferred take is to go back to the first book on theodicy. How can there be evil with this all-powerful God? And there, the book of Job, which is that first response, basically comes up at the very end, says, look, this is the creator being, and 2,200 years ago they didn't even understand the vastness of creation as we do, but already understanding it as they did, said, no one can understand, no one can fathom it, it's the great mystery. And it led a wonderful Rabbi, Harold Kushner, to write a commentary on the book of Job, and he intentionally called it When Bad Things Happen to Good People, not Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, because to answer why, to me, is a pretentiousness, but to respond when is a human obligation. And to me, being a deeply spiritual or religious person is to be a compassionate, intelligent, and responsive human being. And so that's how I would understand that. And in that sense, the Wiesel comment that that's what, let's say, motivates responsiveness. Any, yeah, Eli.
Would you say a Hebrew prayer for everybody? Remember something in Hebrew?
Hine mato umanayim. This isn't a prayer. This is just a saying, and because there's a few. Hine mato umanayim shevedachim gam yachad, which is a lovely teaching. It's a song as well, but it means, behold how beautiful it is for brothers and sisters to dwell together. And what I understand, I brought the Bible because I was going to give, if you wanted, some specific examples as we, as Jews, begin our reading of the Torah anew. We read it in an annual cycle. So we're just reading those beginning stories of Genesis that you would know, of the opening of creation, the story of Adam and Eve, and following from that. And if I were just going to go very quickly, it is not science. The world wasn't created in 7 days. The reason there's a 7-day teaching at the beginning is because Jews understand that there's infinity, but we aren't infinite, we live in time. Therefore, one of the great ways to connect to the infinite is by constructing time with a deep conscious awareness, and that's the opening story of Torah. The next story of Torah, and it also is the one where it tells us that we were created in the divine image, which relates to that sense that, so we have on planet Earth the highest form of consciousness and moral choice of the other creatures. I don't know that in the universe we have the highest, but of the ones we know, we do. And then it tells the story of Adam and Eve, not science. We are not taken out of mud. On the other hand, there's an interesting truth that our composition is the same as the composition of the earth. Our atomic structure is the same. But the story of those opening stories of creation have to do with human responsibility for the environment, for our fellow humans, and I want to come into the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain, of course, the first boy, kills the second boy, Abel, and says, "What? Am I my brother's keeper?" And if you study the book of Genesis more deeply, you actually realize that one of the main threads and most important points of the entire book of Genesis is to teach that yes, you are your brother's keeper. Generation after generation, the lesson gets a little bit more intense, a little bit more complex, until the very end of Genesis. Brother Judah turns to brother Joseph, and not knowing he's his brother, says, I'm my brother's keeper. Book of Genesis ends, and we open the book of Exodus. And here and through the rest of the Torah, now the story takes on another level, because, okay, I got it. You know, that's my brother, right? That's my cousin. We're all part of the same family. But the rest of the Torah is, you know, that kind of thing that you were strangers in the land of Egypt, so you must be good to the stranger. You know what it is to have been poor and oppressed, so you must do right by the poor and oppressed, and you shall have one standard of justice for citizen and stranger alike, so that by the end of the Torah, the lesson is quite clear that I am my brother's keeper isn't about someone who shares some kind of gene thing with you for the last 2 or 3 generations, but it refers to you and the fellow human beings, because as the rabbis teach, the point of the lesson of having there being one Adam is not to teach you something about history or science, but to say that no human being can say to another human being, I am better than you, because we come from the same source. And that was a concrete way of saying that we come from the same source, meaning the Creator being. So here's the song. Hine matovu manayim shever achim gam rai 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 Thanks, Emmanuel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jim. It was fantastic. I'm sure you'd agree. It's one way of this conversation. When I studied theology, of course, in a Christian context in 1980s, it's not that long ago, but if you'd asked me if Jesus was Jewish, I'd have gone, well, I suppose he was. But there's been a lot of work done now on the Jewishness of Jesus and how Christianity is rooted so much into the Jewish tradition. And it's been a sad history. A lot of that has come from, I think, the way I interpret it, inter-Jewish fights, because the earliest followers of Jesus were all Jewish people. And when you're one group, you tend to hurl invective at another group. Why aren't they like us? We believe he's the Messiah. No, he's not. You hurl invective. And that's what we've got, of course, in the Gospels. So some of those terrible passages which John Shelby Spong calls the sins of Scripture. And there are sins of Scripture there. And that's sad, sad history. And it's only in recent times that we're starting to understand our commonalities and the roots that we share, and also the differences, because we're terrible, we're all the same. But so I'd love this conversation to go on. Maybe we should do something through Chapel by the Sea and Emmanuel sort of. Because John Shelby Spong, coming back to him once again, he started off. They started off. No, but they had a conversation where he was in Richmond in the US many years ago. That was one of the very early conversations where the local. They started off with him and the rabbi speaking, and they brought their communities in, and they take turns and having different conversations. So it could be something that would be wonderful to do some this connection already with these wonderful people over here who come down and serve faithfully the meal every Sunday. It could be something we could do. But thanks for coming along tonight, and we've really delighted, and I think we could probably finish up with another Shalom. Havarim, Shalom, Havarim, Shalom, Shalom, Ra'it Ra'od, Shalom, Shalom. It's fairly well known in the Christian tradition. That
Really?
one.
How do you, really?
Yeah, it's reasonably
It
well.
means, shalom is like aloha. It can mean hello, goodbye, or peace. So shalom chavarim generally means peace to you, my brothers and friends, and lehitrot until we see each other next time.
So thank you.
And can I just say something? I don't know if everybody knows it, but the majority of religious churches and synagogues and so forth, they don't always have such educated pastors or reverends or rabbis. And for instance, Rabbi Cummins used to be a lawyer in America. I happen to know that. But Reverend John Carapel used to be a history teacher. So you have,
I didn't know that.
in the eastern suburbs, you have intellectual people that have just spoken. But also, I think it's very important to absorb and feel lucky in this lucky country. Like Rabbi Kevin said, in America, that 1/3 of those people are evangelical, and I was part of that, and I converted to be Jewish, but because of certain things. But I think nobody really realizes how those evangelical people believe, and how militant, and how they carry guns in the back of their pickup trucks, and they are even Ku Klux Klan people in the name of God. And talking about murdering, the abortionists, it's really, I think nobody can understand until you read more about those extreme religions, which is probably just the opposite of Islam. So,
And Islam is changing too. We have in Saral down here from the Gallipoli mosque over in Auburn, yeah. And we had a wonderful conversation at night. His thing was the same as you, that it was basically, maybe he might be a bit biased because he's Turkish, but it was sort of the fall of Turkey and the fundamentalism that really was when you go to Granada or somewhere in Spain, you see the absolute glory of Muslim civilization, Islamic civilization, and their care and concern for Jews and Christians. And once the Christians came in, you got chased out. So did they. Things change.
Worldwide political structure and religious structure in Revelation and all that, but you're supposed to keep away from all these practices which other religions follow and base their beliefs on, because all of it, except for the Jewish and the Christian, every one of them is all man-made. Like the Jehovah's Witnesses, counted all the religions, there's 33,000 different religions on this planet.
Wow. And so and it kind of relates to Steve, and there's a multiplicity and a multiplicity. So what I think is when I was saying the vital role that religion can play is that, some people may want to turn their back on all of it and say, well, all religion is bogus and so forth. But what religion has at its core, ideally, is saying that there's a spiritual reality that is the essence of life. And if we can get back to basics and have a conversation about that, then we'll start looking at values differently, such as that notion that no human being can say I'm superior to another human being just because of where I was born or what my pocketbook is like. So, that we are all each other's brothers and sisters and each other's keeper. And moreover, that we understand, and this is a thing that I'm very big on, that we're actually just part of an animal species, and we have responsibility to those living beings as well. And we're on a planet that is part of a creation as well, to which we have, responsibility, and to take the conversation away from, as Elaine's referred to, that chauvinistic, triumphalistic place, because people say, well, then why not get rid of religion? It's just divisive. But hey, my family, I love my family, and you love your family, and you love your family, and then we have our neighborhoods and we have our communities. We are always diverse, and we are enriched, as John points out, by that diversity, as long as we remember that it's all just an expression of the ultimate unity.
Well, you're supposed to...
but you're absolutely right, and it's all man-made.
Yeah, because you're supposed to love your enemies as well as your neighbors, you know what I mean? The enemies are Satan's followers, and true believers are God's followers, God's chosen people, you know what I mean?
But I guess so it ultimately will depend on how one loves his or her enemies. And, you know, so, and because, for example, a parent loving a child may at times tell that child, here are your limits, here are the boundaries, here are the rules, here are the consequences. Because structure and foundations based in core values are actually an expression of love. And there's a beautiful teaching in our Talmud and our rabbinic teachings that says, the one who is kind to the cruel in the long run will end up being cruel to the kind. That is to say, if love means anything goes and it's not at times a chastisement or corrective, then that's actually not, you know, a real understanding of how love works.
Well, no.
So love your enemies, absolutely, but that doesn't mean that you can't. Yeah,
I hate the bad points, you know what I mean?
Love your enemies, I'll hate you for it. So thank you. Okay, so we've got that on tape. With your permission, we hopefully bring it on our website at some stage. She's hard working, but when she can get it up there.
Can you edit out the spilling of the water?
Oh, I thought you divided the waters.
No, I want that.